So it's very much in the interest of parents, given that they can't rely on the welfare state or on pension schemes, it's more in their interest to make sure that their children marry well in financial terms. And
Yes, I
so,
think that's fair to say. As there's often this phrase that's used 4-2-1, which is basically the one child, the one child policy has to look after two parents and possibly four grandparents. It's also actually, to be fair, 4-2-1 is a sign of one level of success in Chinese society, which is that life expectancy has gone up massively overall in the last 70 or 80 years, not admittedly during horrific periods like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution when people, were beaten or starved to death. But over time, there's no denying that I think it now stands at over, average life expectancy of over 70, which for an upper middle income country is very good. And of course, that means if you have the happy circumstance of living grandparents for quite some time, you then have the practical circumstance of where they're going to live.
mm. And am I right that there is a particular problem with grandparents or elderly people who are living in rural areas and their children have migrated to cities and they maybe only have one child who is now at an enormous distance from them, and just the practical issue of care becomes really acute because there's just no one else that they can rely on?
Yes. When people, both in the outside world and I'd say in China, look and ask honestly, what are the things that might undermine Chinese society, for good or ill, and perhaps, well, I think sadly, it's not the question usually of individual civil liberties and human rights. These are things that attract huge headlines in the West, and for good reason, they should do. But if you look at what actually gives not just individual Chinese, but I'd say, let's say, sociologists within China who are kind of looking at where the big issues are, kind of the heebie-jeebies at night, feeling that actually this is a really tough problem to solve. I would say that disparities between rural and urban China, and in particular the ongoing crisis of children and families in rural China, is central to that. Because a very, very strange, not entirely unique, but nonetheless very distinctive and potentially very negative phenomenon has emerged in the last 25, 30 years, which is essentially that in large parts of China's countryside, I know Jiangxi province, to give an example of a relatively impoverished South Central Chinese province, you have generation after generation of parents who grow up. They let's say they're in their 20s, they're young and strong, and they go far away to the cities to essentially build the skyscrapers and the high-speed railways and the airports and all those amazing infrastructural pieces of equipment that we've seen were built essentially in the 2000s and 2010s as China's answer to the global financial crisis, basically pumped huge amounts of money into the economy and, build, build, build. I mean, Beijing now has two massive international airports, so I wouldn't put it past them to build a third. But, it's basically almost like Franklin D. Roosevelt back in the New Deal in the 30s in America. You just basically create things for people to do and get the economy going. So that's fine as far as it goes. But when those workers go far away, apart from the fact of their physical distance, they don't carry all their welfare rights with them. Essentially, China has an internal passport system called the hukou system, internal residence permit. It's not illegal to go somewhere without your permit, but it does mean that you're not allowed to live in somewhere where you don't have a permit for. And the reason for this is they don't want everyone flooding to the kind of golden streets of Shanghai or Beijing and creating these huge sorts of, impoverished slum areas as you get in Mumbai or Jakarta or Lagos. So that is fair to say that it has been achieved, and that you don't tend to get these huge sort of very impoverished areas in Chinese cities, although you do tend to get sort of grey zones, to put it mildly. But what it means is you can't take your kids with you, so they have to stay behind in the countryside. And who looks after them? Well, it's boiled down in many cases to two answers, both of them not very satisfactory. One of which is grandparents who get older, as grandparents do, and don't necessarily have the kind of child rearing capacity in their whatever 50s or 60s that they might have done in their 20s. Or state boarding schools. And, I'm not talking about Eton or Harrow here. I mean, these are generally pretty underfunded institutions, not least because they get paid for by local governments. And again, listeners who are based in the UK will know that local government financing or lack of it continues to be a huge issue in terms of the social fabric of this country. If you think about things like paying for social care, Well, in China, in rural China, you've got that, times X, because local governments simply don't have money. They have taken on huge debts, which they now have to repay internally, but nonetheless, and paying for the education of children whose parents have gone away in state boarding schools is, well, I was about to say it's not a priority. That's not true. It is a priority. The problem is it's a priority for which there's no money. So, they're having to charge fees to these immensely impoverished kids. Quite often they're leaving school at the age of 12. The pandemic was very, very weird because the disease itself, COVID, didn't spread in the countryside in the way that it did in the cities in China. But actually the effects of it were that they had to go to, tele-learning and so forth. Now, learning from a laptop was pretty difficult, in any country, even if you had a nice house and, a kind of warm environment to do it in. To do it in rural China with lots of children crowding around, one or two screens, turned out to be very, very ineffective. So all in all, China's rural society is massively undereducating the next generation of children who are also suffering, I'll use that word, I think it is true, suffering from the fact that in many cases direct parental contact is sporadic and limited. And that is something to which there is not yet any very clear answer. More money is being put into the countryside. If you look at the 5-year plan that was basically launched last year, talking about the new rural plan was part of that mixture. But the problem is there are some practical issues that make it very, very difficult. One is that as long as you have that sort of internal passport system, people just don't really go between the two areas legally. And frankly, the jobs and the opportunities are in the cities. And secondly, the kind of people who could make this better, like young urban graduates in maths or science, it might sound very romantic to say you should go down to the countryside and teach the impoverished children there, but very few people want to do it because you live in pretty, straitened circumstances. The pay is bad, and you worry that if you surrender your Shanghai or Beijing residence permit and go and live in the countryside, how do you know that the government's ever going to let you back to the big city? So all of these things mean that there is a real crisis in the countryside, and in some senses that's a situation a zillion miles away from what we were talking about earlier with dating apps and urban marriage markets and these kind of very well qualified young women in their 30s, taking corporate careers and working out where, if at all, relationships and marriage fit into their lives. It's almost like two worlds.